When you've lived in your dream home for 15 years, the last thing you expect is someone trying to tear down your fence at 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning. But that's exactly what happened to me last spring. Little did the HOA president know, her obsession with my property line would lead to her own handcuffs clicking shut. Here's how a simple fence dispute turned into the biggest scandal our quiet neighborhood had ever seen. But before I tell you this wild story, take a second to hit that subscribe button and notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. Now let me take you back to where it all began. 15 years. That's how long I'd lived in my corner house on Cedar Street in Maple Grove Estates. The property was everything I'd ever wanted. A charming two-story colonial with a sprawling backyard, mature oak trees, and yes, a beautiful cedar fence that I'd installed myself a decade ago. That fence was my pride and joy, hand-stained and maintained meticulously every spring. It wasn't just a boundary marker, it was where my kids had learned to ride their bikes, where our golden retriever Max had spent countless hours chasing squirrels, and where my wife Sarah had cultivated her prize-winning rose garden. Living in Maple Grove Estates had always been peaceful. Sure, we had an HOA, but for years it had been run by reasonable people who understood the balance between maintaining property values and respecting homeowners' rights. Our annual dues were reasonable, the community pool was well maintained, and everyone generally minded their own business. The most exciting thing that ever happened was the occasional debate about holiday decoration guidelines at our annual meetings. That all changed when Patricia Wilson, Pat, as she insisted on being called, took over as HOA president last January. From day one, something felt off about her leadership style. The monthly newsletter suddenly doubled in length, filled with new interpretations of existing bylaws. Community Facebook posts began disappearing if they questioned any board decisions. But still, I kept my head down, paid my dues on time, and focused on enjoying my home. I should have known something was brewing when Pat started her neighborhood wellness walks every Sunday morning. She'd parade around the development with her clipboard and her little measuring tape, taking notes and photos of anything she deemed potentially non-compliant. I'd see her through my kitchen window sometimes, standing at the edge of properties, with her hands on her hips, lips pursed in disapproval. The first sign of trouble came during the last week of April. I was in my front yard, touching up the stain on a section of fence that had faded over winter, when I noticed Pat slow walking past my property. She made a show of consulting her clipboard, then pulled out her phone to take pictures of my fence. Something about her smirk made my stomach turn, but I waved politely anyway. She didn't wave back. 3 days later, I found an official-looking envelope stuck in my door, not in my mailbox, in my actual door, wedged right between the handle and the frame. Inside was a notice of violation printed on bright yellow paper, claiming my fence exceeded the maximum height allowance by 2 inches and was inappropriately positioned relative to the property line. The notice demanded immediate action, citing bylaws I'd never heard of and threatening daily fines of $100. I remember standing there in my entryway, reading and rereading that notice, feeling a mix of confusion and anger rising in my chest. This was the same fence that had passed inspection a decade ago. The same fence that 3 different HOA boards had approved. The same fence that Pat herself had complimented at last summer's block party before she'd seized power. But what happened? And next, well, that's where this story really begins. Because Pat didn't just want my fence altered or replaced. No, she had bigger plans. Plans that would eventually expose a web of corruption that went far beyond our quiet little neighborhood. And it all started on that Sunday morning in May, when I woke up to the sound of power tools outside my bedroom window. The sound of power tools at dawn wasn't just unexpected, it was infuriating. My feet hit the floor before my mind fully registered what was happening, and I rushed to the window, still in my pajamas. There, in the pale morning light, stood a team of workers in bright yellow vests, their equipment already set up around my cedar fence. Pat Wilson stood among them in her signature navy blazer, clipboard in hand, directing them like a conductor with her perfect French manicured nails. I threw on the first clothes I could find and practically flew down the stairs, bursting through my front door just as one of the workers was positioning a saw against my fence post. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distinct tension that comes before a storm. "Stop!" I shouted, my voice carrying across the yard. "What do you think you're doing?" Pat turned slowly, that same smirk, playing at the corners of her mouth. She was flanked by Gregory Thompson, our newly appointed HOA enforcement officer, a man whose clean-cut appearance and stern expression seemed carefully crafted to intimidate. "Good morning, David," Pat said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I see you've decided to join us for this necessary compliance adjustment." My hands were shaking as I approached them, but I kept my voice steady. "Necessary compliance? You can't just show up on my property and start demolishing my fence. This is trespassing." I pulled out my phone and started recording, which made Gregory shift uncomfortably. Pat's smile never wavered. Actually, according to Section 7, Paragraph 3 of the updated bylaws, the HOA has full authority to address non-compliant structures after a 72-hour notice period. You were served notice on Thursday. She tapped her clipboard meaningfully. "And, since you failed to take action, we're handling it ourselves. The costs will, of course, be added to your monthly assessment." I stepped between the workers and my fence. "Updated bylaws. There hasn't been a community vote on any bylaw changes. You can't just make up rules as you go along." The workers had stopped their activities, looking uncertainly between Pat and me. One of them, a younger man with kind eyes, slowly lowered his saw. That's when Pat made her first real mistake. She nodded to Gregory, who stepped forward and placed his hand on my shoulder, attempting to guide me away from the fence. "Sir, if you continue to interfere with this compliance action, we'll have no choice but to call the authorities." I shrugged his hand off immediately. "Go ahead, call them. In fact, I'll do it myself." I pulled out my phone again, this time dialing 911. Pat's confident expression flickered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered, straightening her blazer and muttering something to Gregory. While we waited for the police, my next-door neighbor, Rachel Martinez, emerged from her house, still in her morning robe, coffee cup in hand. She took one look at the scene and immediately started recording with her phone, too. Pat shot her a warning glance, but Rachel just raised an eyebrow and continued filming. Officer James Brown arrived within minutes, his patrol car rolling slowly up Cedar Street. He stepped out, taking in the scene with practiced neutrality, the workers with their tools, Pat with her clipboard, me standing protectively in front of my fence, and Rachel documenting everything from her driveway. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Brown asked, his hand resting casually on his belt as he surveyed the situation. Before Pat could launch into her prepared speech, I spoke up. "These people are attempting to destroy my property without authorization. I have documentation showing this fence was properly permitted and approved 10 years ago. They showed up without warning, without proper permits, and are trying to force their way onto my property." Pat stepped forward, thrust her clipboard toward Officer Brown. "Officer, we have every right to be here. As HOA president, I have the authority to enforce compliance with our community standards. Mr. Anderson's fence violates several bylaws, and we're simply taking corrective action as outlined in our governing documents." Officer Brown took the clipboard, scanning the papers with a practiced eye. "Ma'am, do you have a current work permit from the city for this fence removal?" Pat's confidence wavered visibly. "Also, I'll need to see documentation of the bylaw changes you mentioned, along with records of the community vote that approved them." The morning sun was higher now, casting long shadows across my lawn as Pat fumbled through her papers. Gregory had taken several steps back, suddenly very interested in his phone. The workers were already packing up their equipment, clearly wanting no part of this situation. "Well," Pat stammered, "the permit is being processed, but our bylaws clearly state—" Officer Brown held up his hand. "Ma'am, without a proper permit, you cannot remove or modify any structural elements on private property. HOA or not, that's a city code." He turned to the workers. "I suggest you gentlemen pack up and leave unless you want to be part of a criminal trespassing report." The workers didn't need to be told twice. Within minutes, their truck was pulling away from the curb, leaving Pat and Gregory standing awkwardly on my lawn. But Pat wasn't done yet. Her face had turned an interesting shade of red as she jabbed a finger in my direction. "This isn't over. David, your non-compliance will be addressed one way or another. The board will hear about this obstruction."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She turned on her heel, Gregory trailing behind her like a lost puppy, and marched back toward her house 3 doors down. Officer Brown stayed a few minutes longer, taking my statement and examining the fence himself. "Look," he said quietly, "document everything from here on out. Something doesn't feel right about this situation." He handed me his card with his direct number written on the back. As the morning chaos subsided, Rachel walked over with a fresh cup of coffee for me. "You know," she said, watching Pat's retreating figure, "she tried the same thing with Tom. Baker's gazebo last month. He caved and took it down." She paused, taking a sip of her own coffee. "Nobody's stood up to her like this before." I stood there, coffee in hand, staring at my fence. The fence I'd built with my own hands, the fence that had been part of countless family memories. This wasn't just about a few inches of height or property lines anymore. This was about standing up to someone who thought they could bully their way through our neighborhood, changing rules on a whim and threatening people's homes. Little did I know, this morning's confrontation was just the beginning. Pat's attempt to tear down my fence would eventually unravel a scheme that would shock our entire community. But right then, standing in my yard with Rachel, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be another Tom Baker. I wasn't going to cave. As Rachel headed back to her house, I pulled out my phone and started making calls. First to the city planning office, then to a lawyer. If Pat wanted a fight, she was going to get one. But this fight would end very differently from what she imagined. The sound of her heels clicking down the sidewalk that morning would soon be replaced by a very different sound, one of metal handcuffs closing around her wrists. That afternoon, I sat in my home office, surrounded by papers, the original fence, permit photographs, property surveys, and a decade's worth of HOA meeting minutes. My wife Sarah brought me lunch, placing a sandwich next to my keyboard as I dug through old emails. "You know she's not going to let this go," she said, massaging my shoulders. "Pat's had it out for anyone who doesn't bow to her authority since day one." I nodded, clicking through another folder of documents. "I know, but something isn't adding up here. These updated bylaws she keeps referencing, they're nowhere in the official records. And look at this." I pulled up a bank statement from our HOA dues account that Rachel had forwarded me. The numbers don't match what was reported at the last meeting. Sarah leaned in, squinting at the screen. That's a pretty big discrepancy." She was right. The difference was in the thousands, and this was just 1 month's statement. I made a note to have my lawyer look into it further. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and research. By evening, I had spoken with 3 other neighbors who had similar stories about Pat's aggressive compliance actions. Each case followed the same pattern: sudden accusations of violations, threats of fines, and pressure to make expensive modifications, all based on bylaws that nobody could seem to find in writing. As I was about to call it a day, my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "Check your email, you need to see this." In my inbox was a forwarded message from Linda Cooper, one of the HOA board members. The subject line read, "Documentation of suspicious activities." I opened the attachment with growing interest. Linda had been keeping her own records, and what she had documented was astounding. Pat hadn't just been making up rules. She had been systematically targeting homes in prime locations, forcing modifications and repairs that always, coincidentally, were handled by the same contracting company, Wilson and Associates Property Services. A quick Google search revealed that Wilson and Associates was registered to none other than Robert Wilson, Pat's husband. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but I needed more proof. I needed something concrete that would show this wasn't just about power trips and petty enforcement. This was about money, and lots of it. I stayed up late into the night, piecing together a timeline of Pat's actions since taking over as HOA president. The pattern was clear. First came the violations, then the threats, then the forced improvements, all funneling money directly into her family's business. My fence wasn't the target. It was just another step in her scheme to generate business for her husband's company. Around midnight, my phone rang. It was Linda Cooper, her voice hushed, even though she was calling from her own home. "David, I couldn't sleep knowing what I know. There's more, so much more, but I'm afraid of what Pat might do if she finds out I'm talking to you." I assured Linda that anything she told me would be kept confidential and handled through proper legal channels. What she shared over the next hour made my head spin. Pat hadn't just been forcing unnecessary improvements. She had been embezzling from the HOA's reserve fund, falsifying documents, and using her position to intimidate anyone who might expose her actions. By the time I finally went to bed, my mind was racing with everything I'd learned. Sarah was already asleep, but she stirred as I slipped under the covers. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she murmured sleepily. "I found more than that," I whispered back. "I found out why Pat really wanted our fence gone, and tomorrow I'm going to start putting a stop to it." As I lay there in the darkness, listening to the distant sound of crickets through our bedroom window, I couldn't help but smile a little. Pat thought she was so clever, building her little empire of fear and control. But she had made one crucial mistake. She had picked the wrong fence, the wrong house, and definitely the wrong homeowner to bully. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But for now, I had what I needed. A clear picture of what we were really dealing with, and the beginnings of a plan to expose it all. The fence that Pat so desperately wanted to tear down was about to become the first domino in a chain reaction that would bring her whole operation crashing down. Morning arrived with the subtle ping of my phone, signaling a new email. This one from Michael Foster, the attorney I'd contacted yesterday. His response was exactly what I needed. He was taking my case, and better yet, he had experience dealing with HOA overreach. The message ended with a request for an immediate meeting at his downtown office. The drive into the city gave me time to organize my thoughts. Traffic moved at a crawl along Main Street as my mind raced through everything I'd discovered. Linda Cooper's revelations about Pat's financial schemes kept replaying in my head, each detail more damning than the last. By the time I pulled into the law office parking lot, I had a clear vision of what needed to be done. Michael Foster's office wasn't what I expected. Instead of the mahogany and leather I'd anticipated, his workspace was modern, filled with plants and natural light. The man himself matched his environment. Mid-40s, dressed in a casual blazer rather than a stuffy suit, with an energy that immediately put me at ease. "So," he said, settling into his chair after our introductions, "tell me about this fence situation." I spent the next hour laying out everything: the early morning confrontation, Pat's illegal attempt at demolition, and most importantly, the evidence of her larger scheme involving Wilson and associates. Michael took notes on his tablet, occasionally nodding or asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You know, David, what started as a simple fence dispute has uncovered something much bigger. This isn't just HOA overreach. We're looking at potential fraud, embezzlement, and abuse of power." He pulled up some documents on his computer, turning the screen so I could see. "I did some preliminary research after your email. Wilson and Associates has been involved in similar situations in other neighborhoods. They operate just under the radar, using HOA authority to force unnecessary repairs and renovations. But they've never been this bold before." Michael's fingers flew across his keyboard as he outlined our strategy. "First, we need to secure all the evidence. Linda Cooper's testimony is crucial, but we need more. Bank records, contracts, meeting, minutes, everything. Then we file injunctions to stop any further compliance actions while we build our case." As we discussed the legal approach, my phone buzzed with a text from Rachel. "Emergency HOA meeting called for tonight. Pat's on the warpath." I showed the message to Michael, who quickly adjusted our timeline. "Perfect timing," he said. "We need to be strategic about this. Pat's probably planning to push through more bogus rule changes. We can use this meeting to our advantage." Leaving Michael's office, I felt more confident than ever. We had a plan. We had the law on our side, and most importantly, we had caught Pat in a web of her own making. The emergency meeting tonight would be interesting, to say the least. I spent the afternoon gathering documents and coordinating with Linda, who had agreed to meet me before the HOA meeting to share additional evidence. We met at the local coffee shop, choosing a quiet corner booth where we could talk privately. Linda looked nervous, constantly glancing over her shoulder as she pulled files from her bag. "These are copies of all the financial records I could access," she whispered, sliding a manila envelope across the table. "Pat doesn't know I have them. She's been manipulating the books for months, moving money between accounts to hide the transfers to Wilson and Associates." The documents were damning. Purchase orders had been inflated. Contracts had been awarded without proper bids, and worst of all, there were clear instances of funds being diverted from the HOA's emergency reserves into accounts controlled by Pat and her husband. "There's more," Linda continued, her voice barely audible above the coffee shop's ambient noise. "Remember the Anderson family on Oak Street? Their voluntary home renovation last month? Pat threatened to put a lien on their house over imaginary violations unless they agreed to use Wilson and Associates for the work. They paid 3 times the market rate. I carefully photographed each document with my phone, making sure to capture every detail. As I did, Linda shared more stories of Pat's intimidation tactics and financial manipulation. The pattern was clear. Pat had turned our HOA into her personal fiefdom, using fear and fabricated rules to line her own pockets. The HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. in the community center. I arrived early, setting up my laptop to record everything. Rachel was already there, helping to arrange chairs. She caught my eye and gave me a subtle nod. She was ready to back me up if needed. Other neighbors began filtering in, the room filling with hushed conversations and nervous energy. Everyone knew something was brewing, but few understood the full scope of what was about to unfold. Pat arrived last, striding in with Gregory Thompson and 3 other board members in tow. She took her place at the front of the room, that familiar smirk playing across her face. "I've called this emergency meeting," Pat began, her voice carrying that false note of authority she loved so much, to address serious concerns about property values and community standards in Maple Grove Estates. "We've seen a disturbing trend of non-compliance that threatens the very fabric of our neighborhood. I watched as she launched into a prepared speech about new enforcement measures and increased fines for violations. The projector behind her displayed a series of graphs and charts, all carefully crafted to create a sense of crisis. But I could see through the smoke and mirrors now. Every proposed solution conveniently required services from Wilson and Associates. When Pat finally opened the floor for comments, I was ready. I stood slowly, laptop in hand, and connected to the projector. I have some concerns about these new measures, I began calmly. But first, I'd like to share some interesting financial information with the community. Pat's face flickered with uncertainty as I pulled up the first document, a side-by-side comparison of the official HOA budget and the actual bank statements Linda had provided. As you can see, I continued, there are some significant discrepancies in our accounts. Would you care to explain these, Pat? The room fell silent as I methodically presented the evidence. Bank transfers, inflated contracts, forced renovations, all leading back to Wilson and Associates. With each new revelation, Pat's composure cracked a little more. Gregory Thompson had shrunk into his chair, while other board members exchanged worried glances. "This is ridiculous," Pat suddenly interrupted, her voice sharp with panic. "You're presenting manipulated documents to undermine the board's authority. I move to have Mr. Anderson removed from this meeting immediately." That's when Linda Cooper stood up. "The documents are real, Pat. I provided them. They're copies of the official records you thought you had hidden." Other neighbors began to stand as well, each with their own story of intimidation and forced compliance. Pat's face had turned an alarming shade of red. She grabbed her papers and started toward the door, but Rachel was quicker. She had already called Officer Brown, who was waiting in the hallway. As Pat tried to push past him, he calmly blocked her path. "Patricia Wilson," Officer Brown said, his voice steady and professional. "I need you to stay right here. We have some questions about these financial records and several complaints of fraud and extortion." The room erupted in chaos as Pat was read her rights. All the poise and authority she had wielded like a weapon just moments before crumbled away, revealing the desperate schemer beneath. Gregory Thompson tried to slip out a side door, but was stopped by a second officer. As Pat was led away in handcuffs, I caught Rachel's eye across the room. She smiled and mouthed, "Worth it." And she was right. The fence that Pat had tried to tear down had ultimately led to her own downfall, exposing a web of corruption that had ensnared our entire community. But even as I watched Pat being escorted to a waiting police car, I knew this wasn't the end. The HOA's wounds would need time to heal, and there would be months of legal proceedings ahead. Yet standing there in the community center, surrounded by neighbors who had finally found the courage to speak up, I felt a profound sense of satisfaction. My phone buzzed. A text from Michael Foster. "Excellent work, but brace yourself, this is just the beginning." He was right, of course. We had won the first battle, but the war for our community's soul was just beginning. Pat's arrest was just the first domino to fall in what would become a much larger investigation into HOA corruption across the county. As the crowd began to disperse, Linda approached me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I've been keeping these secrets for so long, watching her destroy our community piece by piece. I never thought anyone would be brave enough to stand up to her." I placed a hand on her shoulder, watching as the last police car pulled away. "Sometimes," I replied, "all it takes is one person refusing to back down, one fence that wouldn't fall." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Pat's obsession with my fence had ultimately been her undoing. The night air was cool as I walked home, the stars twinkling above our quiet neighborhood. My fence stood exactly as it had for the past decade, a silent guardian of our property line. But now it represented something more, a line in the sand, A stand against corruption, and a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of resistance can spark the biggest changes. The days following Pat's arrest brought a whirlwind of activity to our usually quiet neighborhood. News vans lined Cedar Street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like mechanical sunflowers. Local reporters prowled the sidewalks, eager to interview anyone who would talk about the HOA scandal, as they dubbed it. But the real action was happening behind closed doors, where the true extent of Pat's corruption was slowly coming to light. Diana Lee, an investigative reporter from the local newspaper, had taken a particular interest in the case. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, her recorder running as I shared the details of the morning confrontation that had started it all. Her dark eyes narrowed as she scribbled notes, occasionally nodding as pieces of the puzzle fell into place. So the fence dispute was just the tip of the iceberg, she mused, tapping her pen against her notepad. Have you seen the preliminary audit reports? When I shook my head, she pulled out a thick folder from her bag. Your lawyer should have a copy by now, but these numbers, they're staggering. The documents she shared revealed that Wilson and Associates had received over $850,000 in contracts from our HOA in just 8 months. Every project had been grossly overcharged, with kickbacks flowing through a complex web of shell companies. My fence incident had merely been the latest in a long string of attempted shakedowns. That afternoon, I met with Michael Foster again, this time in a conference room filled with other affected homeowners. Emily Parker, a young mother from Elm Street, wiped tears from her eyes as she described how Pat had forced her to replace her entire driveway last winter. We had to take out a second mortgage, she said, her voice trembling. She threatened to put a lien on our house if we didn't comply. Michael listened intently, his tablet filling with notes as more neighbors shared similar stories. Frank Williams, our elderly neighbor from the corner house, had been coerced into an unnecessary roof replacement. The Martinez family had been forced to redo their landscaping 3 times in 6 months. Each project, without exception, had been handled by Wilson and Associates at inflated prices. The good news, Michael announced, addressing the room, is that we have enough evidence for a class action lawsuit. The bad news is that this goes deeper than just Pat and her husband. We've uncovered connections to other HOAs in the county, all following the same pattern. As if on cue, my phone buzzed with a text from Linda Cooper. Emergency meeting with state investigators tomorrow. They found something big in Pat's home office. Bring your lawyer. The next morning, I arrived at the county courthouse to find the parking lot already full. The small conference room was packed with familiar faces: Linda, Rachel, several other board members, and a team of stern-looking state investigators. At the head of the table sat Kevin Sullivan, a city council member who had taken a personal interest in the case. What we found in Mrs. Wilson's records is disturbing, the lead investigator began, spreading documents across the table. This wasn't just about forcing unnecessary home improvements. She was part of a larger network of corrupt HOA presidents across 3 counties, all working with a handful of contractors to extort homeowners. The evidence was damning. Spreadsheets detailed profits from each project. Emails outlined strategies for intimidating resistant homeowners, and bank statements showed money flowing between multiple shell companies. Pat hadn't just been corrupt. She'd been running a sophisticated racket that had affected hundreds of families. Kevin Sullivan leaned forward, his face grave. This is going to lead to major changes in how HOAs operate in our state. We're already drafting new oversight legislation. But right, now we need your help to identify every victim and document every fraudulent transaction. The task seemed overwhelming, but as I looked around the room, I saw determination in every face. These were my neighbors, people who had been bullied and exploited, now ready to fight back. Linda had already started organizing files, while Rachel was creating a spreadsheet to track all the false violations Pat had issued. As we worked through the mountains of evidence, more disturbing details emerged. Gregory Thompson, it turned out, wasn't just Pat's enforcer. He was a former contractor who had lost his license for fraud. He had been working with Pat to identify homes that could be targeted for unnecessary repairs, using his construction knowledge to fabricate violations. "Look at this," Linda called out, holding up a document. They had a rating system for potential targets. Single parents, elderly residents, people who worked long hours. They specifically went after homeowners they thought wouldn't fight back. The revelation made my blood boil. I thought about Frank Williams, who had spent his retirement savings on that unnecessary roof, and Emily Parker, struggling with her second mortgage. Pat hadn't just been stealing money, she had been preying on the most vulnerable members of our community. That evening, as I walked home from the courthouse, I noticed something had changed in our neighborhood. Neighbors who had once hurried inside to avoid HOA scrutiny were now gathering in their driveways, talking openly about their experiences. The fear that Pat had used to control us was being replaced by a sense of solidarity and shared purpose. Steve Johnson, the local building inspector, had started offering free consultations to help homeowners document fraudulent repair demands. Diana Lee's newspaper articles were encouraging victims from other neighborhoods to come forward. What had started with my fence had grown into a movement for accountability and reform. Back home, I found Sarah in the kitchen, preparing dinner while watching the local news. Pat's arrest was still the top story, but now there were new developments. The investigation had expanded to include bank fraud and money laundering charges. The reporter mentioned that similar cases were being uncovered in neighboring counties. "You know," Sarah said, stirring a pot of pasta, "I ran into Barbara Mitchell at the grocery store today. She said she tried to warn the board about Pat's behavior months ago, but no one would listen. They were all too afraid of retaliation." I thought about Barbara, the former HOA secretary who had resigned in protest of Pat's leadership. She had seen the corruption beginning, but had felt powerless to stop it. How many others had noticed the warning signs, but stayed silent out of fear? Later that night, unable to sleep, I sat in my home office reviewing the growing file of evidence. My phone lit up with a message from Michael Foster. Major breakthrough. Pat's husband started talking to prosecutors. "This is bigger than we thought. Meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m. The next morning brought another revelation. Robert Wilson, facing serious charges himself, had decided to cooperate with investigators. His testimony implicated not just Pat, but several prominent local officials who had helped cover up the scheme in exchange for kickbacks. "This is what we needed," Michael explained as we huddled in his office. "Robert's testimony gives us leverage to go after the entire network. The DA is talking about racketeering charges now." The implications were staggering. Pat's obsession with my fence hadn't just exposed her own corruption. It had inadvertently revealed a widespread criminal enterprise that had been operating in plain sight for years. The simple act of standing up to a bully had started a chain reaction that was now threatening to bring down corrupt officials across the state. As Michael laid out the next steps in our legal strategy, I couldn't help but think about how different things might have been if I had simply given in that Sunday morning. If I had allowed Pat to tear down my fence, would her scheme have continued unchecked? How many more families would have fallen victim to her extortion? My phone buzzed again. Another text from Linda. "You need to see this. Channel 5 just interviewed Pat's former assistant. She's naming names. Turn on your TV now." Michael quickly switched on the office television. There on the screen was Jenny Adams, Pat's former administrative assistant, detailing years of fraudulent activities. She described how Pat had manipulated property records, fabricated violations, and threatened anyone who questioned her authority. "She kept a special file," Jenny was saying, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. "She called it her problem property list. If anyone challenged her, she would find ways to make their lives miserable until they either complied or moved away." The interview cut to footage of my fence, now famous as the catalyst that had brought down Pat's empire. The reporter described, "Our simple property dispute had exposed one of the largest HOA corruption scandals in state history. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as I made my way into the building. Today was different. The media circus had died down, replaced by a tense anticipation that hung in the air like morning fog. Inside, the marble halls echoed with hushed conversations as attorneys and investigators hurried between meetings, their arms laden with documents that would shape the future of our community. Michael Foster met me at the security checkpoint, his usually casual demeanor replaced by focused intensity. "We've got something big," he whispered as we walked toward the conference room. "The forensic accountants finished their preliminary report last night. The numbers are worse than we thought." The conference room was already crowded when we entered. District Attorney Sarah Matthews sat at the head of the table, surrounded by stacks of financial records and evidence boxes. Kevin Sullivan from the City Council was there too, deep in conversation with state investigators. The room fell quiet as we took our seats. "Let's begin," DA Matthews said, her voice carrying the weight of authority. "The forensic audit has revealed that Wilson and Associates wasn't just operating in our county. We've traced similar patterns of fraud across 5 states, all connected through a network of shell companies and offshore accounts." She clicked through a presentation that mapped out the entire operation. Pat's local schemes had been just one small part of a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The forced renovations, the fabricated violations, the inflated contracts, it was all happening on a massive scale, affecting thousands of homeowners across the country. "The total amount of money involved," the DA continued, "exceeds $20 million over the past 3 years alone." The room collectively gasped at the figure. But here's where it gets interesting. The money trail leads back to a private equity firm called Cornerstone Development Group. Kevin Sullivan leaned forward, his face pale. "Cornerstone? They're behind half the new housing developments in the state. They've got contracts with dozens of municipalities." "Exactly," DA Matthews nodded. "And guess who sits on their board of directors? None other than James Wilson, Pat's father-in-law. The entire HOA scheme was just one part of their operation. They've been using corrupt HOA boards to force property sales, drive down home values, and then buy up entire neighborhoods through subsidiary companies." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about petty tyranny and local corruption anymore. Pat and her husband had been foot soldiers in a much larger operation, using HOA authority to help a corporate giant manipulate the housing market for profit. Linda Cooper, who had been quietly taking notes, spoke up. "That explains the pattern we saw in the violation notices. They weren't random. They were targeting specific properties, creating clusters of distressed homes that would be easier to acquire." The meeting continued for hours as more details emerged. Robert Wilson's cooperation with prosecutors had opened a floodgate of information. Former employees of Cornerstone were coming forward with evidence of systematic fraud, price fixing, and illegal market manipulation. As we broke for lunch, Michael pulled me aside. "This changes everything," he said, running a hand through his graying hair. "We're not just dealing with a corrupt HOA president anymore. We're looking at potential RICO charges, securities fraud, and conspiracy at the highest levels." My phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "Emergency meeting at the community center. Tonight. People are scared. We need you there." The community center was packed when I arrived that evening. Neighbors filled every chair, lined the walls, and spilled out into the hallway. The fear in the room was palpable. People who had just begun to recover from Pat's reign of terror were now learning that they had been pawns in an even bigger game. Emily Parker stood up, her voice trembling. "What happens to our homes now? If Cornerstone was behind all this, are we still safe? Can they come after our properties?" Michael Foster, who had accompanied me to the meeting, addressed the crowd. "Your homes are safe," he assured them. "There has frozen all of Cornerstone's assets. They can't make any moves against your properties. In fact, we're working on a class action lawsuit that could help recover the money many of you lost to fraudulent repairs and fines." The relief in the room was almost tangible, but questions continued to pour in. Frank Williams wanted to know about his roof replacement. The Martinez family asked about their landscaping contracts. Each story added another piece to the puzzle of how deeply the corruption had penetrated our community. Steve Johnson, the building inspector, had brought copies of every fraudulent work order he'd discovered. They weren't even trying to hide it toward the end, he explained, spreading the documents on a table. They got sloppy, confident that no one would challenge them. As the meeting progressed, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now exchanged phone numbers and formed support groups. People who had suffered in silence shared their stories. The fear that had divided us was being replaced by a sense of shared purpose and determination. Diana Lee, who had been documenting everything from the beginning, approached me with her notebook open. "You know," she said quietly, "what started with your fence has turned into one of the biggest corporate fraud investigations in state history. How does it feel to be the one who brought it all down?" I thought about that morning when Pat had tried to tear down my fence, how different things might have been if I had simply given in. "It wasn't just me," I replied. "It was everyone who found the courage to speak up, to share their stories, to stand together against something that seemed too big to fight." Later that night, as I walked home under the stars, I noticed something had changed in our neighborhood. Lights were on in houses that had once gone dark at sunset. People were sitting on their porches, talking with neighbors they had previously avoided. The atmosphere of fear that Pat had cultivated had been replaced by something stronger. A sense of community. My phone lit up with another message from Michael. "DA wants to meet tomorrow morning. They're moving forward with indictments. This is going to shake things up at the state level." Sarah was waiting up when I got home, a cup of tea ready on the kitchen counter. "How bad is it?" she asked, seeing the weight of the day on my face. "Bigger than we imagined," I replied, sinking into a chair. "But we're going to fight it, all of us together." She nodded, understanding the magnitude of what we were facing. "You know," she said, looking out the window at our fence, still standing. "Proud in the moonlight, sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest stands." Tomorrow would bring new challenges, more revelations, and probably more shocks as the full scope of Cornerstone's operation came to light. But tonight, sitting in my kitchen with Sarah, I felt a quiet confidence growing. We had exposed the truth, and now there was no going back. The system that had allowed Pat and her corporate masters to prey on honest homeowners was crumbling, and from its ruins, something better would emerge. The morning of the grand jury hearing arrived with an unexpected thunderstorm. Lightning crackled across the sky as I pulled into the courthouse parking lot, the weather matching the electric tension in the air. Today would mark the beginning of formal proceedings against not just Pat Wilson, but the entire network of corruption she had inadvertently exposed. District Attorney Sarah Matthews strode across the marble lobby to meet me, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "We've had another breakthrough," she said, guiding me toward a private conference room. 3 more HOA presidents from neighboring counties came forward last night. They're ready to testify about Cornerstone's involvement in their communities. The conference room was already occupied when we entered. Michael Foster sat at the table alongside Kevin Sullivan and a group of serious-looking federal agents. The wall behind them was covered with photos and documents connected by red string, a visual map of the corruption we'd uncovered. The SEC has officially joined the investigation, one of the agents announced, introducing himself as Special Agent Thomas Reynolds. What we're looking at goes beyond local real estate fraud. Cornerstone Development Group has been manipulating market values across multiple states to artificially inflate their stock prices. A series of graphs appeared on the screen, showing suspicious patterns in property values and stock prices. Every time an HOA under Cornerstone's influence began, aggressive enforcement actions, property values in that area would drop. Cornerstone subsidiaries would then swoop in to buy up homes at deflated prices. It's market manipulation on a massive scale, Agent Reynolds explained. They weren't just stealing from individual homeowners, they were defrauding investors and pension funds that held their stock. Linda Cooper arrived with a stack of newly discovered documents. "Look at this," she said, spreading them across the table. Every HOA president in their network received the same training manual. It outlined exactly how to create false violations, which homeowners to target first, even scripts for intimidating residents who tried to resist. As we pored over the evidence, more disturbing patterns emerged. Cornerstone hadn't just been buying properties, they had been reshaping entire neighborhoods according to a master plan. Communities that had once been diverse and affordable were being transformed into exclusive enclaves, pushing out long-time residents through coordinated harassment and artificial price increases. Emily Parker burst into the room, her face flushed with excitement. "You won't believe what I just found in my attic," she exclaimed, pulling out a dusty folder. "When we bought our house 5 years ago, the previous owners left behind some paperwork. There are letters here from Cornerstone dating back to 2018, offering to buy the property for half its value because of ongoing HOA compliance issues." The documents provided a crucial missing link, proof that Cornerstone had been planning this scheme years before Pat Wilson ever took control of our HOA. They had been patient, methodical, placing their people in positions of authority and slowly tightening their grip on communities across the country. A knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Steve Johnson entered, looking grave. "You need to see this," he said, pulling up a series of photos on his tablet. "I've been re-inspecting all the forced renovations Wilson and Associates performed. The work isn't just overpriced, it's dangerous. They used substandard materials, ignored building codes, and falsified inspection reports. The implications were staggering. Not only had homeowners been defrauded, but their safety had been compromised." Michael Foster immediately began drafting emergency motions to require inspections of every property Wilson and Associates had worked on. As the morning wore on, more pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Diana Lee arrived with recordings from her interviews with former Cornerstone employees. They described a corporate culture of corruption that started at the top, with James Wilson personally approving each new HOA takeover. "The really insidious part," Diana explained, playing one of the recordings, "is how they exploited people's trust in the system. Everyone assumes HOAs are legitimate organizations looking out for community interests. Cornerstone used that assumption to create a perfect cover for their fraud." Kevin Sullivan shook his head in disgust. "We need to completely overhaul how HOAs are regulated," he declared. "This can't happen again." Rachel Martinez arrived next, bringing news from the neighborhood. "People are organizing," she reported. "We're forming a homeowners advocacy group to help other communities recognize and fight these tactics. The movement is spreading." The energy in the room was electric as we prepared for the grand jury presentation. DA Matthews had organized the evidence into a compelling narrative that showed the full scope of the conspiracy. Pat Wilson's attempt to tear down my fence had been just one small thread, but pulling it had unraveled an entire tapestry of corruption. As we broke for lunch, Michael Foster pulled me aside. "You should know," he said quietly. "There have been threats. Cornerstone is getting desperate. They know we have them cornered and they're not going down without a fight." I nodded, unsurprised. We had already seen signs of their desperation. Mysterious cars parked outside witnesses' homes, anonymous emails warning people to stay quiet, sudden pressure from banks holding mortgages on properties involved in the investigation. But the intimidation tactics were having the opposite effect from what Cornerstone intended. Instead of scaring people into silence, they were bringing more witnesses forward. Every threat, every attempt at pressure only strengthened our resolve to expose the truth. The afternoon session began with testimony from financial experts who had traced Cornerstone's money through a labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell companies. They painted a picture of systematic fraud that had generated hundreds of millions in illegal profits. Frank Williams spoke next, his voice steady as he described how the scheme had affected real people. He talked about neighbors forced out of homes they'd lived in for decades, about families bankrupted by fraudulent fines and unnecessary repairs, about the fear that had permeated every community touched by Cornerstone's corruption. As the day drew to a close, Agent Reynolds announced that the FBI had executed search warrants at Cornerstone's offices in 3 states. "We're seizing computers, documents, everything," he reported. "But more importantly, we're finding evidence that this goes beyond just Cornerstone. Other development companies have been running similar schemes." The revelation suggested that what we had uncovered was just the tip of the iceberg. Corporate exploitation of HOAs might be a nationwide problem, hidden in plain sight behind a veneer of legitimate community governance. Outside the courthouse, thunder still rumbled in the distance as reporters gathered for DA Matthews' press and conference. She stood at the podium, outlining the charges being brought against Pat Wilson, Cornerstone Development Group, and their co-conspirators. "This investigation began because one homeowner refused to be bullied," she concluded. "It has revealed a pattern of systematic fraud that affected thousands of families across multiple states. Today, we begin the process of holding those responsible accountable for their actions." As the cameras flashed and questions flew, I stood quietly at the back of the crowd, thinking about how it all started. A simple fence, a Sunday morning, confrontation, and the courage to say no to injustice. Sometimes the biggest changes start in the smallest ways. My phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Just saw the news. You did it." But I knew it wasn't just me. It was every person who had found the strength to speak up, every neighbor who had shared their story, every official who had chosen to do the right thing instead of looking the other way. The storm was passing now, sunlight breaking through. The clouds. As I walked to my car, I passed Pat Wilson being led out in handcuffs, her designer suit replaced by prison orange. Our eyes met briefly, and in that moment, I saw something I never expected: fear. The tables had turned, and the woman who had terrorized our community for so long was finally facing justice. The days following the grand jury indictments brought a flurry of activity to our once quiet suburb. Federal agents descended on Cornerstone's headquarters in waves, emerging with boxes of documents and hard drives that would further expose the depth of their corruption. The sight of James Wilson, Pat's powerful father-in-law, being escorted out in handcuffs made national headlines. Michael Foster's office had transformed into a command center for the expanding investigation. Maps covered every wall, tracking similar HOA schemes across the country. Each pin represented another community that had fallen victim to corporate predators hiding behind the facade of neighborhood governance. That morning, I arrived to find Michael in an intense discussion with Agent Reynolds and a new face, Professor Eleanor Martinez from the State University's Department of Urban Development. She had been analyzing the patterns in Cornerstone's activities, uncovering a disturbing trend in how they targeted communities. "Look at this demographic data," Professor Martinez said, pointing to a series of overlapping maps. They specifically chose neighborhoods with high percentages of elderly residents, single-parent households, and first-time homebuyers, people who might not have the resources or knowledge to fight back against fraudulent HOA actions. Agent Reynolds nodded grimly. Classic predatory behavior. But what's really interesting is how they manipulated property values. They didn't just force people out. They orchestrated entire neighborhood turnovers. The professor pulled up another set of data. Every community they targeted followed the same pattern. First, they'd install their people on the HOA board. Then came the aggressive enforcement actions, targeting specific clusters of homes. As property values dropped in those areas, their shell companies would buy up the distressed properties. Linda Cooper burst into the office, clutching a stack of newly discovered emails. "You need to see these," she said breathlessly. There, from James Wilson to the board of directors at Cornerstone, he was explicitly directing them to use HOA regulations as weapons against homeowners. The emails revealed a calculated strategy of community disruption. Wilson had referred to it as systematic neighborhood re-engineering, a euphemism for forcing out existing residents and replacing them with wealthier buyers who would pay premium prices for the renovated properties. Diana Lee, who had been quietly taking notes in the corner, spoke up. "I've been interviewing former Cornerstone employees all week. The level of coordination is staggering. They had training programs teaching HOA boards how to create and exploit violations. They even had psychological profiles of different types of homeowners with scripts for how to intimidate each category." A knock at the door interrupted our discussion. Kevin Sullivan entered with two state legislators in tow. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "I'd like you to meet Senators Thompson and Rodriguez. They're drafting new legislation to prevent this kind of corporate takeover of residential communities." The senators had been following our investigation closely. They described plans for comprehensive HOA reform, new oversight mechanisms, limits on enforcement powers, and protections for homeowners against predatory practices. "What happened in your community," Senator Rodriguez said, "has opened our eyes to a national problem. We've been receiving reports from across the country of similar schemes. It's time for systematic change." Rachel Martinez arrived next, bringing news from our neighborhood's newly formed homeowners advocacy group. They had created a network connecting affected communities, sharing information and resources to fight back against corporate exploitation. "People are finally speaking up," Rachel reported. "We're getting calls from HOA boards in other states asking for help identifying similar patterns of corruption. The movement is growing." Steve Johnson had spent the morning inspecting another property that had been targeted by Wilson and Associates. His findings were troubling. "They didn't just overcharge for repairs," he explained, spreading photos across the table. "They deliberately created problems that would require more work later. They were manufacturing future violations." As we processed this new information, Emily Parker arrived with her own discovery. She had been going through old community newsletters, tracking the changes in HOA policies after Pat took control. "Look at this," she said, laying out a timeline. "Every major policy change they implemented was designed to make it easier to target specific properties. They were setting up the pieces months in advance. Michael Foster was already incorporating these findings into our expanding legal case." This isn't just about fraud anymore, he explained. We're looking at organized crime charges, RICO violations, criminal conspiracy. The depth of corruption is unprecedented. A series of rapid-fire text messages lit up my phone, updates from various team members working different angles of the investigation. Frank Williams had discovered more falsified inspection reports. The Martinez family had located documents showing illegal kickbacks from contractors. Each new piece of evidence strengthened our case against Cornerstone and their network of corrupt officials. Professor Martinez continued analyzing the data, identifying patterns that could help other communities recognize similar schemes before they took root. The warning signs were there, she noted, but they were subtle. Unless you knew what to look for, it was easy to miss the coordinated nature of their actions. IDD, as the afternoon wore on, Agent Reynolds received word that the FBI had uncovered offshore accounts linked to James Wilson and other Cornerstone executives. The money trail led through a maze of shell companies, revealing the true scale of their operation. They weren't just stealing from individual homeowners, the agent explained. They were laundering money through these forced renovation projects, inflating property values, and using the artificial gains to secure fraudulent loans. It's a sophisticated financial crime wrapped in a veneer of community governance. Diana. Lee's phone buzzed with breaking news. Another HOA president in a neighboring state had come forward with evidence of Cornerstone's involvement in their community. The pattern was the same: targeted harassment, fraudulent violations, forced sales. Kevin Sullivan and the senators huddled in a corner, refining their proposed legislation. They were determined to close the loopholes that had allowed corporations like Cornerstone to weaponize HOA regulations against homeowners. We need to redefine the very nature of HOA authority, Senator Thompson insisted. These organizations were meant to protect community interests, not serve as instruments of corporate greed. As evening approached, Michael Foster called everyone together for a strategy session. The case had grown far beyond our initial expectations, touching on issues of corporate fraud, housing rights, and community governance. What we've uncovered here, he said, surveying the room filled with investigators, activists, and concerned citizens, is just the beginning. This investigation has exposed systemic problems in how residential communities are governed and protected. The question now is, how do we fix it? The discussion continued late into the night, with everyone contributing ideas for reform and rehabilitation. Rachel Martinez proposed creating a support network for communities fighting similar battles. Professor Martinez offered to develop training programs to help homeowners recognize and resist corporate exploitation. As I drove home under a sky streaked with sunset colors, I reflected on how far we'd come from that Sunday morning confrontation. Over my fence, what had started as a simple stand against injustice had grown into a movement for fundamental change in how our communities are governed and protected. Sarah was waiting on the porch when I arrived home, a cup of coffee in her hands. "How bad is it?" she asked, seeing the weight of new discoveries in my expression. "Worse than we thought," I replied, settling into a chair beside her. "But we're making progress. People are waking up, speaking out. Things are going to change." She nodded, looking out at our neighborhood where lights were coming on in houses up and down the street. The fear that had once kept people isolated in their homes was giving way to a new sense of community purpose and solidarity. My phone buzzed one last time. A message from Michael Foster. "Tomorrow's going to be big. More indictments coming. Get some rest. The real fight is just beginning." Dawn broke over the city skyline as a convoy of black SUVs pulled into the Cornerstone Development Group's headquarters. The morning stillness shattered with the synchronized slam of car doors. as FBI agents emerged, armed with boxes and digital forensics equipment. Today's raid wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about following the money trail that Agent Reynolds had uncovered deep within Cornerstone's financial maze. Inside the gleaming glass building, James Wilson's executive suite told its own story of excess and corruption. Golden awards lined the walls, celebrating the very developments that had destroyed countless families' lives. As agents methodically worked through the office, they discovered a hidden safe behind a painting of Wilson's prized yacht. Special Agent Reynolds called me from the scene, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "David, we found the playbook. The actual manual they used to orchestrate these takeovers. You need to get down here with Michael Foster right away." The morning traffic crawled as Michael and I made our way downtown. When we arrived, the building lobby had been transformed into a temporary command center. Professor Eleanor Martinez was already there, surrounded by stacks of documents, her experienced eyes scanning for patterns in the chaos. "This is unprecedented," she said, looking up from a particularly damning memo. They had it all mapped out: demographic targeting, psychological warfare, even scripts for their HOA presidents to use when threatening homeowners. Pat Wilson wasn't just following orders. She was implementing a carefully crafted strategy of community destruction. The manual itself was a leather-bound volume, emblazoned with Cornerstone's logo. Inside, page after page, detailed methods for infiltrating communities, manipulating property values, and forcing out unwanted residents. They even had a scoring system for identifying vulnerable homeowners. Elderly residents scored highest, followed by single parents and families with medical debt. Diana Lee arrived breathless, her reporter's notebook already open. "You won't believe what just happened at the county records office," she announced. "They found a whole set of falsified property documents. Cornerstone wasn't just manipulating current homeowners. They were altering historical records to create fake violations." As we processed this new information, Linda Cooper burst through the lobby doors. "The whistleblowers are coming forward in waves now," she reported. "Former Cornerstone employees, contractors, even other HOA presidents, they're all ready to talk." Among the whistleblowers was Marcus Chen, a former Cornerstone financial analyst who had been secretly documenting the company's illegal activities for years. His testimony painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond our initial discoveries. "They called it Operation Clean Slate," Marcus explained, spreading his own collection of documents across the conference room table. "The goal wasn't just to make money. They wanted to completely reshape communities according to their vision. Anyone who didn't fit that vision had to go." Kevin Sullivan arrived with more state officials in tow, their faces grave as they reviewed the mounting evidence. The implications reached far beyond criminal charges. This was about the very nature of community governance and property rights. "Look at these profit projections," Marcus continued, pointing to a complex spreadsheet. They weren't just calculating returns on property values. They were factoring in the emotional toll their harassment would take, predicting exactly how long it would take to break each homeowner's will to fight. The human cost of Cornerstone's schemes became even clearer as more victims came forward. Emily Parker had organized a support group for affected families, and their stories filled a growing database of trauma and resilience. Rachel Martinez took charge of coordinating the victim testimonies, her living room transformed into a command center for the community's response. "Every story follows the same pattern," she explained, "but each family's pain is unique. We need to make sure their voices are heard." Professor Martinez had begun mapping the psychological impact of Cornerstone's tactics. They didn't just attack people's homes, she observed. They attacked their sense of security, their dignity, their belief in justice. The trauma ripples through entire communities. Michael Foster worked tirelessly to translate these human stories into legal action. Each new piece of evidence strengthened our case, but it also revealed the staggering scope of what we were fighting against. Steve Johnson's building inspections had uncovered another disturbing pattern. They weren't just forcing unnecessary repairs, he explained. They were deliberately creating structural problems that would require future work. They were engineering a cycle of dependency. As the day progressed, more raids were conducted at Cornerstone's satellite offices across the state. Each location yielded new evidence of the company's corrupt practices. Agent Reynolds coordinated the operations from the command center, his team growing as more federal resources were allocated to the investigation. Diana Lee's articles had sparked a national conversation about corporate exploitation of residential communities. Her phone rang constantly with calls from reporters around the country, all seeking information about similar schemes in their areas. Late in the afternoon, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Barbara Mitchell, the former HOA secretary, had discovered a hidden cache of recordings. Pat Wilson had secretly taped her meetings with homeowners, documenting her own manipulation. And threats. The recordings were damning. Pat's voice, dripping with false concern, could be heard explaining to elderly residents how they could avoid trouble by accepting Wilson and Associates' overpriced services. Other recordings captured her coordinating with Cornerstone executives to target specific properties. Frank Williams brought in another crucial piece of evidence, a series of letters he'd received from Cornerstone's lawyers before Pat Wilson's takeover of the HOA. The letters revealed a long-term strategy of community infiltration, with Pat's appointment as HOA president being just one part of a larger plan. As evening approached, the command center hummed with activity. Teams of investigators processed mountains of evidence, while legal experts began drafting what would become one of the largest class action lawsuits in state history. Kevin Sullivan worked with state legislators to craft emergency measures protecting communities from similar takeover attempts. "We can't wait for the legal process to run its course," he insisted. "We need to act now to prevent this from happening anywhere else." Professor Martinez had begun developing a community defense toolkit, drawing on the lessons learned from our investigation. "Knowledge is power," she explained. "We need to give other communities the tools to recognize and resist these predatory tactics." The scope of Cornerstone's operation continued to expand as more connections were uncovered. Their influence extended into local governments, banking institutions, and even media outlets. The corruption had spread like a cancer through the very institutions meant to protect community interests. Sarah texted updates from our neighborhood, where a transformation was taking place. Neighbors who had once lived in fear behind closed doors were now organizing community meetings, sharing information, and building networks of mutual support. As night fell over the city, Michael Foster called a final briefing. The evidence gathered today would shape the next phase of our fight against corporate exploitation of residential communities. But more importantly, it had revealed the power of collective action in the face of systematic corruption. My phone lit up with message after message, updates from various teams, new discoveries, offers of support from other communities facing similar battles. The movement we had started was growing, evolving into something larger than any of us had imagined. Morning light filtered through the courthouse windows as James Wilson took his seat at the defendant's table. The man who had once commanded a corporate empire now looked diminished in his orange jumpsuit, his usual arrogance replaced by a haunted expression. Today marked the beginning of what the media had dubbed the people versus Cornerstone, and the tension in the courtroom was palpable. District Attorney Sarah Matthews stood before the packed gallery, her voice steady as she delivered her opening statement. What we will prove in this court goes beyond simple fraud or corruption. This case reveals a systematic attempt to destroy communities for profit, to turn the dream of home ownership into a nightmare of exploitation. Michael Foster sat beside me, his notepad already filling with observations. The prosecution's table was surrounded by boxes of evidence, each one representing countless hours of investigation, countless stories of lives disrupted by corporate greed. Professor Eleanor Martinez had taken a seat in the front row. Her academic expertise would be crucial in explaining how Cornerstone had targeted vulnerable communities. Behind her sat rows of affected homeowners, each face telling its own story of resistance and resilience. Agent Reynolds slipped into the courtroom just as the defense began their opening statement. James Wilson's high-priced attorney painted a picture of misunderstanding and overzealous local officials trying to distance Cornerstone from the actions of their HOA presidents. Diana Lee furiously scribbled notes as the prosecution presented their first piece of evidence, the leather-bound manual discovered in Wilson's office. Each page projected onto the courtroom screen revealed another layer of calculated manipulation. Linda Cooper was called as the first witness. Her testimony detailed years of observing Pat Wilson's tactics, explaining how Cornerstone's strategies had been implemented at the local level. The defense tried to shake her testimony, but Linda's meticulous documentation left little room for doubt. Rachel Martinez followed, presenting the database of victim testimonies she had compiled. Her voice cracked with emotion as she described families forced from their homes, elderly residents bankrupted by fraudulent fines, communities torn apart by fear and suspicion. Gavin Sullivan testified about the legislative failures that had allowed Cornerstone's scheme to flourish. His proposed reforms had gained significant support, but today was about holding accountable those who had exploited the system's weaknesses. As the morning session progressed, Marcus Chen took the stand. His insider knowledge of Cornerstone's financial operations provided crucial context for the jury. He explained how the company had structured their predatory operations, hiding illegal profits behind layers of shell companies. Steve Johnson presented his findings from months of building inspections. His technical expertise helped the jury understand how Wilson and Associates had deliberately created structural issues to justify future repairs. The evidence of intentional property damage was damning. The afternoon brought a surprise witness. Robert Wilson, Pat's husband, had agreed to testify against his own father. His testimony revealed the inner workings of the family business, including private conversations that showed James Wilson's direct involvement in the scheme. Barbara Mitchell's recordings were played for the court, each one more damning than the last. Pat Wilson's voice filled the courtroom, her calculated manipulation of vulnerable homeowners now exposed for all to hear. Frank Williams took the stand. Next, his dignified presence commanding attention as he described how Cornerstone had targeted elderly residents. His testimony brought several jurors to tears as he recounted the toll their actions had taken on his neighbors. Emily Parker spoke about the support group she had organized, giving voice to hundreds of affected families. Her strength in the face of intimidation had inspired others to come forward, creating a wave of testimony that couldn't be ignored. The prosecution's evidence mounted as the day continued. Financial records showed the staggering scope of Cornerstone's illegal profits. Property documents revealed patterns of systematic manipulation. Expert witnesses explained how the company had exploited legal loopholes to further their scheme. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows, I was called to testify. Walking to the witness stand, I caught James Wilson's eye. The man who had orchestrated so much suffering couldn't meet my gaze. My testimony began with the fence incident that had sparked the investigation, but quickly expanded to encompass everything we had uncovered. The defense tried to paint me as the disgruntled homeowner, but the evidence supporting my account was overwhelming. Sarah watched from the gallery as I described how our community had come together to fight back. Her presence reminded me of what we were really fighting for. Not just justice for past wrongs, but protection for future generations of homeowners. Professor Martinez's expert testimony followed, providing academic context for Cornerstone's predatory practices. Her analysis showed how the company had specifically targeted vulnerable communities, exploiting social and economic vulnerabilities. The day's proceedings concluded with Agent Reynolds presenting the FBI's findings. His methodical explanation of Cornerstone's criminal enterprise left no doubt about the coordinated nature of their activities. As the judge adjourned court for the day, the impact of the testimony hung heavy in the air. James Wilson was led away by deputies, his empire crumbling with each new revelation. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Diana Lee as she summarized the day's events for her national audience. The story had captured public attention, sparking discussions about corporate accountability and community rights. Michael Foster gathered our team for a brief meeting in a nearby coffee shop. The day's testimony had been strong, but we knew Cornerstone's defense team would fight back hard. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new attempts to discredit our evidence. Rachel Martinez shared updates from our neighborhood, where residents had gathered to watch the trial coverage together. The community that Cornerstone had tried to destroy had emerged stronger, more united in their determination to seek justice. Kevin Sullivan reported progress on his legislative reforms. Other states were beginning to take notice, recognizing the need for stronger protections against corporate exploitation of residential communities. Linda Cooper continued organizing the mounting evidence, preparing for tomorrow's testimony. Each new witness would add another piece to the puzzle, another example of how deeply Cornerstone's corruption had penetrated our communities. Professor Martinez worked late into the night, analyzing patterns in Cornerstone's activities that could help identify similar schemes in other areas. Her research would become a blueprint for community defense against corporate predators. As I drove home through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, I noticed lights on in houses that had once gone dark in fear. People were sitting on porches, talking with neighbors, reclaiming their sense of community. Sarah waited up for me, knowing how draining the day's testimony had been. We sat together on our back porch, looking out at the fence that had started. Sometimes the biggest changes begin with the smallest acts of resistance. Assistant. The second week of the trial brought unexpected revelations that sent shockwaves through the courthouse. Marcus Chen had discovered a hidden server containing encrypted emails between James Wilson and several prominent state officials. The forensics team worked through the night to decrypt the messages, revealing a network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of local government. Morning light streamed through the courthouse windows as Agent Reynolds presented the new evidence. The encrypted communications showed how Wilson had systematically bought influence, ensuring that complaints about Cornerstone's activities would be buried in bureaucratic red tape. Michael Foster seized on this new information, weaving it into our expanding case against Cornerstone. The jury listened intently as he connected the dots between Wilson's political manipulation and the suffering of countless homeowners. Professor Eleanor Martinez took the stand again, this time armed with data showing how Cornerstone had targeted specific neighborhoods based on demographic profiles. Her analysis revealed a disturbing pattern of discrimination hidden behind seemingly neutral HOA regulations. Diana Lee's coverage of the new developments made national headlines. Other investigative journalists began uncovering similar schemes in different states, suggesting that Cornerstone's model had been adopted by other development companies. During the afternoon session, a surprise witness stepped forward. Thomas Grant, a former city planning official, testified about how he had been pressured to approve Cornerstone's fraudulent permits. His voice trembled as he described years of accepting bribes in exchange for looking the other way. Kevin Sullivan worked frantically during court recesses, coordinating with state officials to freeze assets linked to the corrupt officials named in the encrypted emails. The web of financial transactions revealed how deeply the corruption had penetrated local government. Linda Cooper organized a team to cross-reference the newly discovered communications with our existing evidence. Each connection they uncovered strengthened the case against Cornerstone and their network of enablers. Rachel Martinez reported a surge of new testimonies from homeowners who had previously been too afraid to come forward. The encrypted emails had given them confidence that their stories would finally be heard and believed. Steve Johnson's latest inspection reports took on new significance in light of the revealed corruption. The fraudulent building permits now clearly traced back to specific officials who had been on Cornerstone's payroll. Emily Parker coordinated with support groups in other states, creating a nationwide network of homeowners fighting similar battles. The movement she had helped start was growing into a powerful force for community advocacy. Frank Williams testified again, this time about suspicious interactions with city officials who had dismissed his complaints about Wilson and Associates' fraudulent repairs. His detailed records helped establish the timeline of official corruption. Barbara Mitchell provided crucial context for the encrypted communications, explaining how Pat Wilson had often hinted at having friends in high places who would ensure her actions went unchallenged. Sarah texted updates from our neighborhood, and throughout the day, the community had organized a watch party to follow the trial proceedings, with residents sharing their own stories of encounters with corrupted officials. Professor Martinez worked with her research team to analyze the broader implications of the revealed corruption. Their findings suggested that similar schemes might be operating in hundreds of communities across the country. The afternoon brought another breakthrough when Agent Reynolds announced that multiple city officials had agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Their testimony would expose the full scope of Cornerstone's influence-buying operation. Michael Foster called for an emergency meeting with the prosecution team. The new evidence had opened possibilities for additional charges, including racketeering and conspiracy at the highest levels of local government. Diana Lee's sources indicated that federal authorities were preparing to launch investigations. In other states where Cornerstone had operations, the case was expanding far beyond our initial community dispute. Kevin Sullivan received word that state legislators were fast-tracking new anti-corruption measures in response to the revelations. The political will for reform had finally caught up with the reality of corporate exploitation. Linda Cooper discovered patterns in the encrypted communications that suggested Cornerstone had been planning similar operations in other communities. Their expansion plans had been halted just in time. Rachel Martinez organized a public forum where homeowners could share their experiences with corrupted officials. The stories painted a devastating picture of systematic betrayal of public trust. Steve Johnson worked with other building inspectors to identify properties that had received fraudulent permits. The scope of necessary re-inspections would require a massive mobilization of resources. Emily Parker coordinated with legal aid organizations to ensure that affected homeowners would have access to representation. The fight for justice was expanding to include more communities and more victims. As evening approached, James Wilson sat slumped at the defense table, his carefully constructed facade of legitimate business finally crumbling. The evidence of his corruption was now impossible to deny or explain away. Professor Martinez presented new analysis showing how Cornerstone's political manipulation had disproportionately affected minority communities. The racial implications of their scheme added another layer to the prosecution's case. Frank Williams shared decades of correspondence with city officials, revealing a clear pattern of dismissed complaints and ignored violations. His meticulous record-keeping had become invaluable to the investigation. Barbara Mitchell's documentation of HOA board meetings took on new significance as prosecutors traced connections between Pat Wilson's actions and the instructions contained in the encrypted emails. The day's testimony concluded with a powerful statement from a former Cornerstone executive who had decided to cooperate with prosecutors. His insider account confirmed every suspicion about the company's criminal intent. Sarah organized a neighborhood meeting to discuss the implications of the revealed corruption. The community was determined to prevent similar schemes from taking root in the future. As night fell, Michael Foster received word that more indictments were forthcoming. The investigation had expanded to include dozens of local officials who had facilitated Cornerstone's operations. Agent Reynolds coordinated with FBI offices in other states, sharing information about Cornerstone's methods and the signs of similar corporate corruption schemes. Diana Lee's latest article exposed how Cornerstone had used their political influence to block previous investigations and silence whistleblowers. The story of corruption had become impossible to ignore. Kevin Sullivan worked late into the night, drafting legislation that would require greater transparency in HOA operations and stricter oversight of development companies. Linda Cooper continued analyzing the encrypted communications, uncovering more connections between Cornerstone and corrupt officials with each passing hour. The impact of the day's revelations rippled through our community and beyond. What had started as a dispute over a fence had exposed a nationwide pattern of corporate corruption and political manipulation. Midweek brought a startling development that shocked even the most seasoned investigators. A series of anonymous emails arrived at Michael Foster's office containing surveillance footage from inside Cornerstone's executive boardroom. The videos showed James Wilson and his inner circle explicitly discussing their strategy to manipulate property values and force out unwanted residents. Agent Reynolds immediately assembled a team to authenticate the footage. The timestamp details and metadata confirmed their authenticity, providing unprecedented insight into the corporate culture that had enabled such widespread corruption. The courtroom fell silent as the first video played on the large screen. James Wilson's voice filled the room, calm and calculated, as he outlined plans to target specific neighborhoods. "Remember," he told his executives, "we're not just buying properties, we're engineering demographic shifts. The right pressure applied to the right people will create the vacancies we need." Professor Eleanor Martinez took extensive notes. During the video presentation, her expertise in urban development helping to contextualize Wilson's strategies. The targeting of vulnerable communities wasn't just opportunistic, it was a cornerstone of their business model. Diana Lee's live updates from the courtroom caught the attention of major news networks. The footage provided the kind of clear, undeniable evidence that transformed complex corporate crimes into compelling narratives the public could understand. Michael Foster used the lunch recess to coordinate with prosecutors in other states where similar footage might exist. The videos suggested that Cornerstone's board meetings routinely included discussions of their illegal activities, potentially creating a treasure trove of evidence. Linda Cooper worked with forensic experts to analyze background details in the footage, identifying previously unknown participants in Cornerstone's scheme. Each new face represented another thread to unravel in the expanding investigation. Rachel Martinez organized a special session of the homeowners support group, helping people process the emotional impact of seeing their struggles discussed so callously by corporate executives. The raw footage had brought back painful memories for many residents. Steve Johnson paused his building inspections to review technical discussions captured in the videos. Cornerstone executives had openly discussed methods for creating artificial property damage, confirming his worst suspicions about their practices. Emily Parker noticed familiar addresses being mentioned in the footage, homes of families she had helped through her support network. The videos provided crucial context for countless individual stories of harassment and displacement. Kevin Sullivan spotted several state officials in the background of various meetings, adding urgency to his legislative reform efforts. The footage suggested that regulatory capture had been a key component of Cornerstone's strategy. Frank Williams recognized discussions about his own property in one video segment. The executives had specifically targeted his home due to its strategic location, seeing his age as a vulnerability they could exploit. Barbara Mitchell identified Pat Wilson in several meetings, proving direct coordination between local HOA actions and Cornerstone's corporate strategy. The supposedly independent HOA president had been taking direct orders from James Wilson himself. Sarah coordinated with other community organizers to document every property mentioned in the footage. The pattern of targeting revealed clear, discriminatory practices that would strengthen civil rights claims against the company. Professor Martinez's research team began mapping the strategic plans discussed in the videos against actual neighborhood changes. The correlation between Cornerstone's targeting and community displacement was unmistakable. Agent Reynolds received word that similar surveillance systems had been discovered in other Cornerstone offices. Teams were being dispatched nationwide to secure potential evidence before it could be destroyed. Diana Lee interviewed former Cornerstone employees who could provide context for the meetings shown in the footage. Their insights revealed a corporate culture built on predatory practices and contempt for community rights. Michael Foster worked late into the evening, preparing motions to expand the scope of discovery based on revelations from the videos. Each hour of footage provided new avenues for investigation and prosecution. Linda Cooper organized volunteers to transcribe the video content, creating searchable records that could help identify additional victims and conspirators. The work was emotionally draining, but crucial for building our case. Rachel Martinez noticed patterns in how executives discussed different neighborhoods, their casual bigotry revealing underlying discriminatory motives. The footage would be valuable for civil rights organizations fighting similar corporate practices. Steve Johnson compiled a list of properties where Cornerstone had deliberately created maintenance issues. The videos provided timeline details that would help prioritize emergency inspections and repairs. Emily Parker identified several families who had already left the community, driven out by tactics discussed in the footage. Her support network began efforts to locate these displaced residents and include their experiences in the legal record. Kevin Sullivan presented video excerpts to state legislators, finally convincing skeptical colleagues of the need for immediate regulatory reform. The footage had transformed abstract policy discussions into urgent calls for action. Frank Williams shared his documentation of HOA harassment with prosecutors, now able to connect specific incidents to corporate directives seen in the videos. His meticulous records provided crucial timeline verification. Barbara Mitchell recognized specific HOA policy changes being dictated by Cornerstone executives, proving that local governance had been completely co-opted by corporate interests. The pretense of community control had been exposed as a sham. Zara helped organize neighborhood watch sessions to review the footage, identifying local properties targeted in Cornerstone's discussions. The community's collective memory helped connect corporate plans to actual events. Professor Martinez presented preliminary findings showing how Cornerstone's strategies had been refined and replicated across different communities. The videos revealed an evolving playbook for corporate takeover of residential neighborhoods. Agent Reynolds coordinated with cybersecurity experts to secure the surveillance system that had captured the footage. Preserving the integrity of potential evidence became a top priority as the investigation expanded. Diana Lee revealed that similar surveillance systems had been standard practice in Cornerstone's offices, suggesting that years of incriminating footage might still exist. The initial videos could be just the beginning of damaging revelations. Michael Foster received calls from attorneys in other states sharing information about similar corporate practices they had encountered. The footage had provided a blueprint for identifying and fighting predatory development schemes. Linda Cooper worked through the night, cross-referencing video discussions with HOA records to establish clear chains of command. The footage proved that local HOA actions had been directly controlled by Cornerstone executives. Rachel Martinez helped residents prepare impact statements describing how Cornerstone's targeting had affected their lives. The videos provided context that made individual stories more powerful and compelling. Steve Johnson identified specific construction crews mentioned in the footage, opening new avenues for investigating fraudulent repairs and manufactured damage. Each detail helped build a more complete picture of Cornerstone's operation. Emily Parker uncovered discussions of psychological tactics used to pressure vulnerable residents. The executive's casual cruelty in planning these strategies highlighted the human cost of corporate predation. The impact of the surveillance footage continued to ripple through legal and political circles, transforming our understanding of how corporate interests could capture and corrupt local governance structures. What had started as a simple fence dispute had exposed systematic exploitation of communities across the nation. The weight of the surveillance footage evidence had barely settled when a new threat emerged from an unexpected direction. Early morning brought urgent calls from Michael Foster. Cornerstone's remaining executives had launched an aggressive counteroffensive, filing lawsuits against key witnesses and attempting to discredit the video evidence. The corporate boardroom buzzed with tension as we gathered to assess the situation. Agent Reynolds spread documents across the table showing how Cornerstone's legal team had begun targeting individual homeowners with defamation suits, hoping to silence them through financial intimidation. "They're trying to bury us in paperwork," Michael explained, his tie loosened after hours of emergency meetings. "They've filed motions in 6 different jurisdictions, challenging everything from the authenticity of the videos to the legitimacy of our witness testimonies." Professor Eleanor Martinez arrived with fresh analysis of Cornerstone's legal strategy. Their counterattack wasn't random. They were specifically targeting witnesses whose testimony connected the surveillance footage to specific criminal acts. The corporation was fighting to survive, and they weren't playing fair. Diana Lee's sources revealed that Cornerstone had hired a crisis management firm specializing in discrediting whistleblowers. Their playbook included personal attacks on witnesses, manipulation of social media narratives, and strategic leaks to sympathetic media outlets. Linda Cooper discovered attempts to tamper with HOA records that could corroborate the video evidence. Security cameras caught unknown individuals attempting to access the community center's archives late at night. The stakes were escalating dangerously. Rachel Martinez reported increasing pressure on community members who had agreed to testify. Anonymous calls, mysterious vehicles parked outside homes, subtle threats disguised as friendly advice. Cornerstone was pulling out all stops to intimidate witnesses. Steve Johnson found his professional credentials being questioned through anonymous complaints to the licensing board. His meticulous documentation of Wilson and Associates' fraudulent repairs had made him a prime target for corporate retaliation. Emily Parker's support group meetings were infiltrated by individuals claiming to be victims, but actually gathering intelligence for Cornerstone's legal team. The corporation was attempting to undermine the community's unity from within. Kevin Sullivan faced unexpected opposition to his regulatory reform bills as corporate lobbyists suddenly took intense interest in local HOA legislation. Money was flowing freely to politicians willing to block increased oversight of development companies. Frank Williams discovered his Social Security checks had been mysteriously delayed, a clear warning shot from those with influence in government. Bureaucracy. The message was clear: back off or face escalating consequences. Barbara Mitchell's car was vandalized the night before she was scheduled to authenticate HOA documents that supported the video evidence. The incident had Cornerstone's fingerprints all over it, but proving it would be another matter. Sarah coordinated with local police to increase patrols in our neighborhood as reports of intimidation multiplied. The community's determination remained strong, but fear was beginning to creep back into daily life. Professor Martinez's research team documented each incident of retaliation, building a pattern that revealed the systematic nature of Cornerstone's counterattack. Their response proved just how dangerous the surveillance footage had become to their interests. Agent Reynolds mobilized additional resources to protect key witnesses, but the FBI's reach was limited against Cornerstone's army of private security contractors and corporate investigators. Diana Lee received anonymous documents suggesting that major media conglomerates were being pressured to downplay the story. Corporate advertisers with ties to Cornerstone were flexing their financial muscles behind the scenes. Michael Foster worked through the night, filing counter-motions and seeking emergency injunctions to protect witnesses. The legal battle was expanding faster than our resources could match. Linda Cooper uncovered evidence that Cornerstone was attempting to create a false paper trail, suggesting the surveillance footage had been doctored. Their technical team was working overtime to undermine the video evidence's authenticity. Rachel Martinez organized community watch groups to counter surveillance of witness homes, but the psychological toll of constant vigilance was beginning to wear on everyone. Steve Johnson's inspection reports were challenged by a suddenly appeared team of independent experts hired by Cornerstone. Their credentials were impeccable, their conclusions suspiciously favorable to the corporation. Emily Parker discovered her support group's confidential files had been accessed, exposing vulnerable community members to corporate pressure. The breach shook people's faith in the support systems we'd built. Frank Williams received an unsigned letter detailing every medication he took, a chilling reminder of how deeply Cornerstone could delve into personal information when motivated. Barbara Mitchell found her home office ransacked, though nothing appeared to be missing. The invasion carried a clear message about the price of standing against corporate power. Sarah coordinated with cybersecurity experts to protect community members' digital lives as reports of hacking attempts increased. Cornerstone's technical resources seemed limitless. Professor Martinez's academic credentials came under attack from industry-funded think tanks, questioning her methodology and conclusions. The corporate machine was working to discredit every expert supporting our case. Agent Reynolds tracked a web of shell companies Cornerstone was using to fund their counteroffensive, each layer designed to obscure the source of their apparently unlimited legal war chest. Diana Lee's investigation revealed connections between Cornerstone's crisis management firm and similar corporate counteroffensives against whistleblowers in other industries. This was a well-practiced playbook. The pressure continued mounting as Cornerstone's strategy unfolded. Their goal was clear: wear down our resources, break our unity, and bury the truth under an avalanche of legal challenges and personal attacks. Michael Foster called an emergency strategy session to assess our options. The community's determination remained strong, but we needed new approaches to counter Cornerstone's aggressive tactics. Just as Cornerstone's counter-offensive seemed at its peak, salvation arrived from an unexpected source. A plain brown envelope appeared on Michael Foster's desk, containing a single USB drive and a handwritten note from someone who couldn't stay silent anymore. The drive contained internal emails from Cornerstone's crisis management firm, detailing every aspect of their campaign to discredit our witnesses. Names, tactics, payoff amounts. It was all there, meticulously documented by someone inside their own operation. Agent Reynolds immediately launched a trace on the source, while our technical team verified the email's authenticity. The documents revealed a systematic campaign of witness intimidation that made Cornerstone's counteroffensive look even worse than their original crimes. Professor Eleanor Martinez pored over the emails, identifying patterns that connected Cornerstone's intimidation tactics to similar campaigns against other community organizations. This wasn't just about our case anymore. It was about exposing a corporate playbook for suppressing local resistance. Diana Lee's eyes widened as she scrolled through the documents. The crisis management firm had detailed dossiers on every key witness, including surveillance photos and personal information. They had been planning this counterattack long before the surveillance footage emerged. Linda Cooper worked late into the night, cross-referencing the new emails with her existing evidence. Every incident of harassment, every mysterious accident, every coincidental problem could now be traced back to specific orders from Cornerstone executives. Rachel Martinez discovered that several concerned citizens who had been disrupting community meetings were actually paid actors, hired through a specialty firm that provided corporate agitators. Their scripts had been carefully crafted to sow discord and fear. Steve Johnson found documentation proving that the independent experts challenging his inspection reports were on Cornerstone's payroll. The emails included detailed instructions on how to discredit his findings without appearing obviously biased. Emily Parker uncovered evidence that the breach of her support group's files had been orchestrated by a professional hacking team. The emails revealed Cornerstone's desperate need to identify and pressure potential witnesses before they could testify. Kevin Sullivan received copies of internal memos showing how corporate lobbyists had coordinated their attacks on his regulatory reforms. The paper trail led straight back to Cornerstone's board of directors. Frank Williams learned that his delayed Social Security checks weren't bureaucratic accidents. Cornerstone had contacts inside the system deliberately causing problems. For uncooperative witnesses, the corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Barbara Mitchell found proof that her office break-in had been conducted by former military contractors now working for Cornerstone's security division. The emails detailed every step of the operation, including photos of her private files. Sarah coordinated with cybersecurity experts to analyze technical details from the leaked emails. Cornerstone's digital warfare capabilities were sophisticated, but now we had their playbook and could build effective countermeasures. Professor Martinez's research team mapped out the network of shell companies and contractors Cornerstone used for their intimidation campaigns. The corporate veil was finally being pulled aside, revealing the machinery of suppression beneath. Agent Reynolds received authorization for additional surveillance as the emails provided probable cause for expanding the investigation. Cornerstone's attempt to silence witnesses had only exposed more of their criminal enterprise. Diana Lee worked with her editorial team to prepare a comprehensive exposé of Cornerstone's intimidation tactics. The story would run simultaneously in multiple outlets, making it harder for corporate pressure to suppress. Michael Foster prepared new legal filings based on the leaked evidence. Cornerstone's campaign of witness intimidation would now become part of the central case against them, strengthening our position significantly. Linda Cooper organized the flood of new evidence, creating clear timelines showing how Cornerstone's counteroffensive had been planned and executed. Their methodical approach to suppression would now be used against them. Rachel Martinez helped community members document every incident of harassment, now able to connect each action to specific orders in the leaked emails. The pattern of intimidation was undeniable. Steve Johnson reviewed construction records with renewed purpose, finding more examples of fraudulent repairs ordered by Cornerstone executives. The evidence of their systematic property damage continued mounting. Emily Parker strengthened security around support group meetings, now able to identify and exclude Cornerstone's paid infiltrators. The community's safe spaces would be protected. Frank Williams shared his story of bureaucratic harassment with investigators, adding another layer to the growing evidence of Cornerstone's abuse of power. His experience revealed how corporations could weaponize government systems against citizens. Barbara Mitchell worked with security experts to protect sensitive HOA documents, implementing measures to prevent further corporate espionage. The community's records would be secured against future attacks. Sarah coordinated with local police to enhance protection for witnesses, sharing intelligence from the leaked emails to help identify potential threats. The community's physical safety remained a top priority. Professor Martinez's analysis revealed patterns linking Cornerstone's tactics to broader trends in corporate suppression of community organizing. Their methods were common across industries, but rarely exposed so clearly. Agent Reynolds expanded his investigation to include the crisis management firm and its network of contractors. Each new thread led to more evidence of corporate misconduct. Diana Lee's reporting sparked renewed interest in similar cases nationwide. Communities fighting corporate development began sharing information and strategies, building a broader movement for accountability. The tide was turning as more evidence emerged. Cornerstone's attempt to silence witnesses had backfired spectacularly, providing proof of ongoing criminal activity that strengthened the case against them. The final hearing arrived on a bright autumn morning. The courthouse steps were crowded, with media crews and community members as James Wilson made his final walk into justice. His corporate empire had crumbled, his intimidation tactics had failed, and now he would face the consequences of his actions. Judge Henderson's courtroom fell silent as the proceedings began. The evidence against Cornerstone was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, internal emails, witness testimony, and financial records painted a clear picture of systematic corruption and criminal intent. Diana Lee sat in the front row, documenting every moment for her final story. The case that began with a simple fence dispute had exposed corporate exploitation of communities across the nation. Her coverage had helped countless other neighborhoods recognize and resist similar schemes. Michael Foster delivered a compelling closing argument, weaving together the threads of evidence we had gathered over months of investigation. Each piece supported our central claim that Cornerstone had deliberately weaponized HOA regulations to destroy communities for profit. Agent Reynolds watched from the back of the courtroom as years of careful investigation reached their conclusion. The case had grown far beyond our initial complaint, revealing patterns of corporate misconduct that would change how communities protect themselves. The verdict was decisive. James Wilson and his top executives received lengthy prison sentences. Cornerstone's assets were frozen, with substantial restitution ordered for affected communities. Pat Wilson's dream of controlling our neighborhood had led to her entire family's downfall. Kevin Sullivan stood outside afterward, announcing comprehensive new legislation to protect homeowners from corporate exploitation. The reforms would ensure that HOAs serve their communities, not predatory development interests. Our neighborhood gathered that evening in the community center, celebrating not just our victory, but the bonds we had formed in resistance. The fence that started it all still stood, a symbol of one community's refusal to be bullied into submission. Sarah squeezed my hand as we watched neighbors sharing stories and plans for the future. The fear that had once kept people isolated behind closed doors had been replaced by genuine connection and shared purpose. Real change had come from our stand against corporate bullying. Communities across the country were learning from our experience, building networks of resistance against predatory development. The power of united neighbors had proven stronger than corporate greed. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.